We're now back to our programming. I'm delighted to say we're moving on to our second panel, which will be led by Susan Shirk, and that will be focused on Peter's storied public service career. Let me start by introducing Susan. Many of you know Susan. Susan is a research professor and chair of the 21st Century China Center here at GPS. She's among the most influential experts on US-China relations, with a storied career herself in public service. As the most charming person on the planet, Susan also played a very big role in my decision to join my esteemed colleagues here at GPS and UCSD some years ago. Susan and Peter go way back. You've heard a little bit about that. They've shared most of their professional lives down the hall from one another, much of their social lives clinking glasses together, which is a long way of saying Susan really is in the best position to incriminate Peter. Sadly, I suspect she'll refrain from that with us this afternoon, but perhaps not entirely. Susan, the microphone is all yours.
Thanks so much, Josh. Well, it certainly is my pleasure and my honor to share the second brick in the arc of Peter's brilliant career. We started with his intellectual ideas and research. Now we're talking about how he applied these ideas in the policy process. And then we'll end by talking about how he brought these ideas and policy experience back in building the school. So the policy experience. Most academics never get the chance to try out their ideas in practice. Many would never want to, many would not know how to. But Peter went to DC in 1994 to work in the Federal Communications Commission. He had had the opportunity to be a Counsel on Foreign Relations Fellow working at AT&T, which at the time that was very unusual too, to take a CFR fellowship in the private sector. And what he learned there at AT&T was AT&T monopoly was just being broken up, and a new domestic telecommunications market was being created. And he saw how this would have spillovers for other countries as well. So in his research, he wrote papers and a book on the possibilities for international telecommunications agreements designed to promote competition and lower the costs of international communications. So he kind of dreamed up what the United States should try to get. And then he went to Washington to get it. So he became the theoretician and strategist of the World Trade Organization telecom agreement, working closely with FCC Chair Reed Hundt, whom we're going to hear from in a minute, and the US Trade Representative Charlene Barshevsky, who unfortunately is not able to join us today. Most political appointees working in government feel gratified if they're able to accomplish anything. One thing people told me, other political appointees, when I went to Washington, is the professionals in government just basically treat you like you're the summer help. You're there for a short time and then you're going to leave, and they kind of work around you. So you have to work doubly hard to actually have some effect. But Peter certainly had a tremendous impact. So he went on to propose scrapping the accounting and settlement rates by which phone companies settle accounts with one another. And he discovered that the United States was running a $4 billion trade deficit on phone calls because of the oddities of the system. And in typical Peter Cowhey fashion, he said, "This is nuts. It's crazy. We shouldn't be doing this." And he persuaded others in the Clinton administration to say that the United States would not do that anymore. And then he and Reed Hundt worked together in trying to negotiate with other countries, which was not an easy task because it meant that these countries were going to lose a lot of money that they were then making through international phone calls. But as a result of his work, phone rates around the world fell and the world got a lot smaller. So that was only the first time in Washington. The second time in Washington was in the Obama administration, and the US Trade Representative Ron Kirk is with us today to talk about that experience when Peter headed up the trade transition for Obama and then went and served as the senior counselor to the US Trade Representative, working closely with Ron Kirk, particularly on the on Asian trade issues, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which many of us still hope will be revived in the future. And then after that, he's had a lot of other important policy experiences from outside the government that we'll also hear about today. So this is really quite a remarkable career that Peter has had in putting his intellectual ideas into practice in government. And that's what we'll be talking about next, starting with Reed Hundt. Reed was, as I said, chairman of the Federal Communications Commission when Peter was working on international telecommunications trade at the FCC. Reed, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Susan. Great to be with you and great to be with Secretary and Mayor Kirk. What I'm going to do is discuss specifically a time period between 1993 and 1997 in which Peter, I won't say single-handedly because he got so many other people to carry shovels as well, but he was intellectually and in tactical terms, the general who won this particular battle. Let me take you back in time. As the historian Maitland said, what is now in the past was once in the future. So I did not know in November 1993, I did not know in November 1993 when I was confirmed to be the FCC chair, I did not know two things. I did not know that the internet had been effectively commercially invented that fall by the invention of a browser called Mosaic that made it possible for everyone to put a website on their own computer and essentially took the internet from an academic and military exercise to a huge commercial phenomenon. And I did not know that that same August of 1993, Congress had given me an immensely large blank canvas on which to figure out how to create and get started in a certain direction, the digital cellular industry in the United States. So if you're in government and by accident, people say, well, man, you were there when the internet was more or less launched commercially and all of digital cellular, you had a lot of foresight, to go there at that time. That wasn't true. It was accidental. But Peter saw it in San Diego, and he saw one more thing. He saw that a trade negotiation called the Uruguay Round, after 8 years, was heading to a conclusion, which it reached in April of 1994 in the Marrakesh Agreement. And that trade round leading to the Marrakesh Agreement was the a beginning of the World Trade Organization, which officially, under the Marrakesh Agreement, started in January of 1995. What Peter saw, unbeknownst to me, that's for sure, is that all three of these things were occurring at the exact same time and created an opportunity to do what he thought was best for the world. Three things, just to summarize: the internet becomes commercial, digital cellular gets launched in the United States, and there's a thing called the World Trade Organization that is going to be a forum in which it is possible to have a global treaty. Between April of 1994 and not quite 3 years later, actually February 15, 1997, Peter's idea, I consider it to be genius. You all should probably decide at the end of my summary, but I have a feeling you'll end up agreeing with me. His genius idea and his tactics caused in February 1997, 69 countries to agree to what was called a market access protocol for basic telecom. And that's just jargon. Here's what they agreed to. They agreed that in their countries there would be competition in communication services. They would include data, i.e. the internet, and it would include cellular. Number two, they agreed to interconnection, meaning they agreed that their networks would connect to the networks of other countries. What that meant is that these 69 countries agreed that the digital cellular industry and the internet would wrap seamlessly around the entire world and create two new mediums, two new fabrics for information exchange. And then, of course, we saw later that these two fused so that the digital cellular mechanism is the way the internet is accessed for now approximately 5 billion people. That's a big deal that Peter got them to agree to that. What was the alternative? The alternative was that these two mediums, cellular and the internet, would fractionate and be regional or geographic or nation state in their definition and boundaries. We face the same issue now as China wants to take the internet in a certain direction. That's an expertise that Susan and her colleagues, have and that they've studied. But what China is trying to do is break something that Peter, arguably more than any other person in the world, helped create, which is this seamless medium that connected everybody, not just governments and not just companies, everybody to each other. The third thing that was in that agreement was that there would be transparent licensing. That was an anti-bribery, anti-corruption measure, but it also was a way for Western companies, and particularly American companies, to get licenses to operate in these 69 countries. And the last thing that was agreed to is that all these countries that signed the deal would create independent regulators. In other words, they would imitate the FCC. What that meant is that the control by the executive branches of these countries, many of whom were autocracies, controlled by the executive branches of the medium of communication would be relinquished and given over to an independent agency. In other words, the ideal Western paradigm was put down in writing, and Peter and others, but especially Peter, got 100% of what was then the industrialized world to agree. The countries signing this agreement accounted for more than 90% of all revenue in communications and information services on a global level. Now we'll get to the tactics. So Peter needed somebody to do what he instructed, and that somebody was me, the FCC chair. And so he was introduced to me, and he explained how I needed to hire him, which I did, in order to draft our foreign policy, which I did not know that the FCC would have. And then Peter explained what that policy would be. And I'll put it in the bluntest of possible terms. As Susan has said, The FCC, it turned out, Peter knew this, I didn't. It turned out that the FCC had exclusive power to regulate the payments in any long distance communication between countries, between the United States and the Philippines, between the United States and Hong Kong, between the United States and any other country. We could regulate the American side of that. We could set the prices. Those connections over time have become a way for the countries. Let's take, for example, Hong Kong. The country could say, or Hong Kong could say, any incoming call from the United States, the people who are making the call have to pay us here in Hong Kong a certain amount of money. This meant that they could extract, in effect, a tax from the American businesses that had to make the calls and from Chinese Americans who had families in Hong Kong. Those were the two primary sources of the revenue. In Hong Kong, the government and the company that it regulated, Cable and Wireless, were extracting more than $100 million a year from this particular service. Over the entire world, the export of money from the United States through this mechanism to other countries was much greater than the foreign aid budget of the State Department. So Peter's idea, in a nutshell, was that I would tell my counterparts in all these countries that if they did not sign Peter's trade agreement, we were going to cut the rates to zero. And after that, we would be able to negotiate how fast the cut would take place, but they had to agree to sign the agreement. When he explained this to me, I said, I think this is a Chicago-style negotiation. But what Peter sold was not just the communication of a threat, but the vision that if these behavioral agreements that I mentioned were adopted by these countries, they would see the same explosion of job creation and wealth creation that they could tax in their own countries, and that they could cause their own countries to increase in national income. In other words, they could imitate the information revolution that was creating such tremendous wealth in the United States, so much wealth, including even government wealth, that our government went into a surplus in the last 2 years of the 1990s. He was selling the merits of the idea backed by an element of compulsion. This was extremely difficult for many, many countries to accept, even for the people in those countries who embraced the vision. It was extremely difficult to accept because it meant in every single country extreme disruption for some very powerful vested interest. In conclusion, let me say, in the case of Hong Kong, Cable and Wireless took us out on a boat in the harbor outside of Hong Kong, and as they expressed their reaction to this plan, it seemed as if what they were saying is that they were going to throw us off the boat and let us drown. And country after country, let me just say the conversations were dramatic. But we had the full backing of our trade ambassador, Charlene Bershevsky, because as she said in the party that Susan hosted last night, Peter had also gotten her to be the principal negotiator, since what we were doing was something that was part of the WTO that she was creating. The second reason this was extremely difficult was not just the vested interests like Cable and Wireless, but in some of the very small countries, the revenue from the United States over the telephone lines into the country accounted for more than 100% of the revenue of the entire communications industry in the country. How could it be more than 100%? It was more than 100% because some of the money was taken off the top and used for government functions, other government functions. This was true, for example, of almost every country in the Caribbean. Now, the difficulty of accepting these changes is even more to Peter's credit, because had we simply insisted on the threat, it probably wouldn't have really worked, meaning our bluff might have been called, presidents and other executives would have called Bill Clinton, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The vision needed to be sold too. The last little story I'll tell, just by way of wrapping it all up, is arguably the strangest of the ways that an agreement was actually obtained was how we got Argentina to sign. And what happened in Argentina is that the president of the country on a Friday decided to pull out of his previous willingness to sign it. And Peter arranged for us to get the State Department the Washington to call our ambassador. And then the word back was that the president couldn't be reached because he had made himself unavailable. How did he make himself unavailable on that Friday night? He'd gotten on the presidential plane and decided that it would fly around in the Andes Mountains until we stopped calling. This is a true story. So then Peter said, we really have to push them very hard. What should we do? And I said, I don't know. You've been telling me for the last 2.5 years. What are we going to do? He said, you're going to tell the people in Argentina that you're not going to mess with the rates. You're just not going to allow any long distance calls from Buenos Aires to New York to occur on Monday morning when the stock market opens. This is a true story. So exercising powers that I did not know I had, I told the American long distance companies that they could not accept any calls from Buenos Aires to New York on Monday morning, and that they should tell everybody in Buenos Aires right away. They did tell everybody in Buenos Aires right away, and everybody in Buenos Aires who was invested in the stock market found a way to reach the president to get him to land the plane he called up in Argentina, signed the deal. Thank you, Susan.
That's great. Well, that was really illuminating. I really feel that I understand the accomplishments that you, Reed, and Peter wrought during this period a whole lot better. And I've been talking with Peter about this for years, but I actually feel that I have a deeper understanding, especially of the negotiation tactics. And in order to understand Peter's abilities as a negotiator, we have invited a couple of our friends from the other countries with whom Peter negotiated to tell us a little bit about what kind of negotiator he was. The first one is Carlos Casasus. He, at the time in the 90s, was the Undersecretary for Communications and Technological Development in Mexico's federal government. So he was one of the people who sat across the table from Peter. And but after negotiating with Peter, he became actually a very good colleague and friend, and he lives in Mexico City and continues to be on the International Advisory Board of GPS. So let's hear what Carlos has to say.
Some 25 years ago, Mexico and the United States had monopoly markets in their international long-distance telephone traffic. The dominant carriers had been able to introduce price distortions that affected consumer welfare, created huge balance of payments imbalances, and prevented innovation and development. I was appointed regulator of the Mexican telecommunications market just after a dramatic devaluation of the Mexican peso had taken place in 1994. The US regulator had threatened to close the international long-distance market if Mexico did not unilaterally remove its pricing distortions. At that time, Peter was in a sabbatical at the FCC. He had been assigned the task to look at the international long-distance market from the US perspective. During our first conversations, he immediately realized the magnitude of both countries' problems and constraints. Instead of threatening retaliatory measures and winner-take-all solutions, we were able to develop a new framework that allowed both countries to transit gradually to competitive markets on both sides of the border. This benefited our mutual constituencies and avoided what could have been disastrous outcomes. Peter negotiated in a style that is the prototype of a win-win attitude, understanding the issues and constraints, developing trust among the parties, having accurate communications with higher-level decision makers, and finding creative alternatives are all essential in this type of situations. These personality traits are all quintessential to Peter. It has been a great personal pleasure to have been on different sides of a negotiating table and to have achieved, as an outcome, a friendship of so many years. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you so much, Carlos. It was great to hear your perspective on those negotiations. Now we're going to ask a friend from China, Shuelan, who is the Dean of Schwarzman College at Tsinghua University, the former Dean of the School of Public Policy and Management at Tsinghua, and an expert on Chinese innovation policy. He and Peter worked together. They weren't exactly negotiating with one another, but Shuelan was the head of the Chinese experts group for the US-China high-level panel on innovation policy when Peter was the head of the US experts group. And later on our panel, we're going to hear from John Holdren, who in the Obama administration was President Obama's science advisor, and he was director also of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So he was the American who led this high-level panel on innovation policy, and the person who asked Peter to lead the experts group. So let's hear what Dean Shuelan has to say about working with Peter on the US-China innovation issues.
Hi, this is Lan Xue. I'm a professor and dean of Schwarzman College in Tsinghua University. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to make a few remarks about Peter at this symposium. First of all, I'd like to congratulate Peter for having made enough contributions to the world that you can now retire and really enjoy life. Although I'm not sure whether Peter can really make the transition. I first got to know Peter was when I visited the GPS about 10 years ago. We had lunch together during my visit and exchanged some ideas about how to serve as a better deans and talked about innovations. Peter was very proud of the San Diego's ecosystem for innovation, and that cultivated many innovative companies, including Qualcomm. None of us realized that a few years later, we would work together on the topic, formally in the US-China Innovation Dialogue. US-China Innovation Dialogue was started in 2010 as part of a US-China Economic and Strategic Dialogue. At the first meeting in this dialogue, I proposed to establish a joint expert committee to address some analytical issues in the bilateral disputes around innovation, which was happily accepted by the two principals, John Holdren, science advisor for President Obama, and Minister Wang Gang, Minister of Science and Technology of China. For the few years when Peter and I served as co-chairs on the Joint Committee, we worked more like colleagues rather than negotiators. Don't get me wrong. Peter is a staunch patriot who never shy away with issues on principles, and is always very frank about his opinions. At the same time, he was also very open-minded, willing to listen to different ideas from the other side. Also, Peter's hospitality and easygoing style can easily melt down any suspicion and distrust so that people can engage in discussion with a disagreement, but in good spirit. I can never forget the dinner gathering at Peter's house in early 2016, the last time the Joint Committee meet. The family-style gathering allowed us, all of us, to open our heart and our minds, which facilitated so much the discussion next day. Boy, how much we missed those old days. Today, US-China relations have reached its lowest point for decades. Specific issues put aside, we need people like Peter, and for that matter, Susan and other colleagues at GPS, who can stick to the principles and national interests with humanity, rationality, and open hearts. Peter, congratulations again. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Shrelon. I must say, personally, I hear from you and hear about how well academics from the two countries, US and China, have been able to work together really right up until recently. It really makes me hope that all of us, especially Peter in his retirement, because he is working a lot now on US-China innovation issues, will have another opportunity to try to restore cooperation between the two countries. Now we'll move to Ron Kirk. Ron Kirk, it's a great honor to have him with us today on our panel. He was the US Trade Representative for President Obama and worked closely with Peter when Peter was counselor for Obama. And he's going to tell us a little bit about what that experience was like. Thank you for joining us today, Ron.
Susan, thank you for having me and giving me an opportunity to once again thank Peter for being such a great friend, such a great colleague, and such a great mentor. My experience with Peter was a little bit different than Reed's in that it wasn't as much centered around his technical expertise as my, as I will say, a lack of familiarity with all of the details of trade. When President Obama nominated me to be US Trade Representative in 2009, my exposure to the world of global trade had come principally from my service as Secretary of State to Governor Ann Richards when we lobbied very heavily for NAFTA, which at the time was the largest sort of multilateral trade initiative the United States had undertaken. And being a Texan at that point, we saw extraordinary benefits for us. And then somewhat by accident, a year later, I ran for and was elected the mayor of Dallas shortly after NAFTA went into effect, and believed one of the keys to turning our city around, helping it gain more of a global persona, was making Dallas the capital city of NAFTA. So like a lot of mayors of large metropolitan areas, my introduction to the world of international trade principally was from the perspective of trade promotion and a general belief, in my case, a very strong belief, in the positive value propositions of trade in terms of it being an economic driver for our communities. Now you fast forward, and now I've been asked to assume the role as the lead trade negotiator for our country. And I brought with me and understanding that not everyone viewed trade as favorably as we did in Texas. And for that most part, most mayors and states and people who lived west of the Mississippi, and thought that we had our work cut out for us to restore a very different value proposition around trade. Peter Cowhey was serving on my transition team at that time. And one, I was drawn to Peter because of his broad depth of knowledge. My wife says I was drawn to him because we were the only two adults in the room. She said her biggest criticism of Washington is that everybody's either 55 or 25. But one, Peter had a very thoughtful but calming and welcoming demeanor about him. And frankly, he was one of the few people who was part of my transition team that wasn't absolutely convinced that they should have held the job of U.S. Trade Representative instead of me. So as we began to move through the transition, Peter just became a very welcome colleague, someone who really took his time to help me understand many of the nuances of the trade agreements that I was to inherit, the different elements of trade, the importance of them. But he was just all someone that I could trust. And I was struck by the reality, given the pace of our confirmation process at that time, and the initial focus of the Obama administration, almost singularly as it should have been, on pulling our economy out of the horrible economic circumstance that we inherited in 2009, that I could use someone with Peter's demeanor, but his broad breadth of knowledge of trade policy and the communication of that and how we would build support, not only to help me in my own journey to a deeper understanding of the importance of this critical topic, but I also frankly leaned on Peter in his more professorial demeanor as a resource to teach all of these young people who were coming into government with us that had had no exposure to trade at all. So shortly after the transition team dissolved, I went to Peter and asked him if he would consider taking a sabbatical and coming on with me as sort of a senior advisor, a counselor to be at USTR. And after very little thought, thankfully he agreed to do so. And that was critical for me because I was nominated along with the rest of the cabinet that fall. I wasn't confirmed until March. Only one of the three deputies U.S. trade positions that I had to fill had I filled at that point. And many of you are familiar with Ambassador Demetrius Morantis because of his long work on the Hill. He had served as trade advisor to Senator Max Baucus, so I was reasonably certain that he would be confirmed. But for very practical, selfish reasons, I needed an adult at USTR to kind of help steady the ship, begin to build, put my stamp on the way I wanted to do things until I was able to be confirmed, and later then Ambassador Morantis and Miriam Shapiro and Michael Punk. So for me, Peter was a counselor, a trusted advisor, a consigliere, and as many of you noted, because of his comfort with resolving issues over an appropriate libation, Peter and I had a chance to bond and relate in a way that I couldn't with so many of my junior staff. But as I began that journey of recasting our trade policy in a world in which I thought too many Americans had soured on the overall proposition of trade, I thought we needed to re-examine, Susan, how we talked about trade and how we made it real to the American public, why important it was for us. One of the joys of leading an organization like the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, as one of my mentors and fellow Texans, former Trade Ambassador Bob Strauss, said to me when I took on the job, he said, you know, the best thing about this versus being mayor, You don't have, now I'm quoting Bob Strauss. He said, you don't have all those goddamn employees. But the great thing about USTR, it's an incredibly competent staff. They come from the world of commerce and the ITC and others. They are huge believers in trade, but I thought I had as much of a challenge in getting them to understand the fact that we were believers in this important mechanism to expand US values around the world through both commerce and introduction of new disciplines like Peter and Reed had done. None of that meant anything if the American public wasn't buying it. And Peter was just as critical to me in helping our team at USTR to realize we had to stop being so dismissive of labor and other organizations that were historically, if not skeptical, outright hostile to more trade agreements because they really believed they'd been aggrieved by it. And having married a fabulous woman who grew up in Detroit and inherited a family full of retired steel workers and auto workers, I got a pretty quick education and how the rest of the world looks at it. But Peter helped us shape a new trade agenda that was built more around the idea that we would not dismiss their criticisms, but listen to them, take heart to the complaints, that many Americans believed that we had swapped cheaper T-shirts and electronics for jobs going elsewhere, and felt that other countries and trading partners, whether they were developed economies or longtime trade partners as well, frankly took advantage of us. So Peter was critical in helping us shape the president's trade agenda that acknowledged the reality the United States had to remain globally interconnected with only 5% of the world's consumers, but that we had to do it in a different way. That we would enforce our agreements, we would work equally hard to protect the interests of our small business and exporters, particularly given the reality of how our economy was moving to a more digital base, which you've talked about. So Peter was critical in helping us shape that policy internally, but also as a confidant, as someone willing to come in and kind of help me challenge the internal infrastructure in a way that only Peter could, that was both professorial in a thoughtful way, but challenging them to think about how we did, the way we did it, the way we talked about it, in a way that I think that it was welcomed and not seen as a threat. And with that, obviously that 6-month sabbatical became a 1-year sabbatical, but I can't thank you enough. And for all the reasons you've heard from everyone on the call, Peter's willingness to share his genius, his intellect about issues critical to technology and communications, but do it in a way that people can understand and not be threatened, and willing to apply that in an academic sense, but also understanding the need to share that with those of us in government is a critical way to making our world better, one way at a time. And I think it says everything that I think. I'm proud that Peter still thinks of me as a friend. We've kept in touch over the years. Our families have become great friends. And I am just honored and thrilled to be a part of this tribute to someone that I consider one of our great educators, thinkers, negotiators of our time. So Peter, congratulations.
Well, thank you so much. That was really wonderful to hear how your experience really shows that it's the melding of this, of Peter's character and his personality, his ability to teach people and persuade people and work together with people, plus his analytic intellect together managed to accomplish great things. So it was great to hear from you. And now we're going to move to John Holdren, who is a professor at the Kennedy School at Harvard, Previously, when he taught at Berkeley, he actually was one of Peter's dissertation advisors. And then, as I mentioned earlier, he and Peter worked together on the high-level innovation dialogue between the US and China. So thanks so much for joining us today, John.
Well, thank you, Susan. I have to say, though, you stole some of my thunder by mentioning my role as one of Peter's dissertation advisors. I was going to start by saying I'm not sure I hold the record among those on this call for the longest acquaintance with Peter Cowhey, but my acquaintance with him does go back almost 50 years. In 1973, I went to UC Berkeley with a campus-wide appointment as Assistant Professor of Energy and Resources. One of the senior faculty members who persuaded the university to appoint me to that position was the eminent political scientist, Ernst Haas. I soon discovered that his ulterior motive was the idea that I might be able to support him in advising his prize PhD student, one Peter Cowhey. I agreed to do this, and it was for me a classic win of the sort that occur in academic life, because I'm not sure how much Peter learned from me, but I learned a great deal from him. As Peter got closer to submitting his dissertation, I thought it prudent to tell him the story of Henry Kissinger's political science dissertation at Harvard. Very famously, Henry Kissinger's professor told him, knowing of Henry's tendency to wax eloquent at great length, his advisor told him that he was only going to read the first 200 pages of whatever dissertation was submitted to him, and he would grade the dissertation on the basis of those 200 pages, no matter how many more there were that went unread. I made a similar threat to Peter. Didn't work. Very shortly thereafter, he appeared in my office with a stack of paper more than a foot high, which was the draft of his dissertation, and plopped it down on my desk. I won't say how many pages of his dissertation I actually read, but I did recommend to Ernie Haas that he get an A. It was a magnificent piece of work, and from then until now, I have watched Peter's career, his rise to prominence, his extremely beneficial effects on public policy as well as on higher education, with great admiration, but no surprise. It was already clear when he was a PhD student that this was a rising star. So let me jump to the other end of our acquaintance, which has already been mentioned by Susan Shirk and by Shui Lan, who I'm very happy to see. Shui Lan was actually, among many other contacts with US colleagues, a visiting senior fellow in the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Kennedy School when not too long after I first went there, and Shui Lan and I built a number of collaborative efforts together. As Shui Lan mentioned, the US-China dialogue on innovation policy originated in the strategic and economic dialogues that were held between the United States and China starting in 2009. And in 2010, as Shui Lan mentioned, it was decided to launch a bilateral China-US innovation dialogue focused on the policy issues, and particularly on the mutual complaints that each country had about discriminatory innovation policies in the other. And the origin of this was that attempts to address these disagreements on innovation policy had initially begun in the Department of Commerce. Those crashed and burned. Then in the Treasury Department with Chinese counterparts, that crashed and burned. And it was the idea of Hillary Clinton, who was then Secretary of State, and Tim Geithner, who was Secretary of the Treasury, in the course of the 2019 Strategic and Economic Dialogue, as they watched Wan Gong, the Chinese Minister of Science and Technology, and I interact, something that we did very fluidly because we had actually been partners for almost a decade in joint research between our universities before either one of us was appointed to our positions in government. Wan Gong as Minister of Science and Technology, and I as President Obama's science advisor. So we knew each other, respected each other, worked very well together. And so when we ended up with these positions and co-presiding over the joint high-level commission on U.S.-China science and technology cooperation, again, Secretary Clinton, Secretary Geithner decided, why not try to see whether a dialogue led by scientists and technologists on both sides, but bringing in representatives of Treasury Department and its counterparts, Commerce and its counterparts, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative and counterparts, might do better, precisely because the two leaders would be people who knew each other and had worked together effectively over quite a long period. And so we started this innovation dialogue, and as Shui Lan also related, at the first meeting in 2010, he suggested that besides the high-level political appointees who actually took part in the main dialogue, that we should have an experts group, which would be responsible for exploring on the ground in both countries what was actually going on in relation to innovation policy and in relation to the complaints each side had about the other, and in relation ultimately to whether or not the recommendations that this bilateral panel, chaired by Wan Gong and me, made to our governments, were those recommendations actually being followed? And I very quickly agreed with this idea and proceeded to try to persuade Peter Cowhey to be the leader of the experts group on the US side. Peter fortunately was persuadable. Among other characteristics that Ambassador Kirk has already mentioned, he is somebody who has trouble saying no. Especially, I suppose, he had trouble saying no to somebody who had signed his dissertation, although those many years before. And so Peter took that job on, and I have to say that he and Shui Lan did a fantastic job. They became, that experts group became a major component of our work, greatly contributed to and enhanced our effectiveness in this domain. And of course, the reasons for that have already been mentioned. Peter shares with Shui Lan a capacity to represent his country's interests, but with an open mind and with a friendly demeanor and with an attitude that we can find solutions to this if we look hard enough. We can figure this out. I think that's been Peter Cowhey's attitude about virtually everything since I first met him as a PhD student at Berkeley. I'm sure it will remain his attitude in what is certain to be his failed retirement, failed in the sense that he will end up working just as hard in retirement as he did in his long and immensely successful career at UC San Diego and in national and international political life. So Peter, the heartiest congratulations. I am so happy to be able to take part in this celebration of your amazing career and your amazing achievements and your amazing characteristics as a human being.
Well, thank you so much for that, John. So interesting to hear how you recognize Peter's talents so early and were able to put them to such good use more recently. So I wonder if we have a little bit of time to ask our panelists a couple of questions, because I feel that some of the issues that Peter was working on in government are still extremely relevant today. And they really speak to some of the big questions that Dan Bresnitz and the other panelists in the first panel were bringing up, especially globalization and global trade in services, the interactions in science and technology, which today are being challenged by the geopolitical competition between the US and China, and very much by the lack of confidence that American citizens feel in the outcomes that will be produced by global trade and cooperation. So this kind of populist nationalist trend is very strong, and the Biden administration confronts them today just as the previous administrations did. So maybe let me just first of all ask Ron Kirk whether or not you see any prospect at all for a revival, or Reed or John, if you want to comment too, of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Do you think the Biden administration would dare invest political energy in having the United States rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Japan has tried to keep alive with a number of other countries?
Susan, I certainly hope so. And as someone who comes from a state that is the largest beneficiary of our trade policy, in which there are more jobs tied to our trade, not just with Mexico and Canada, but globally, and serving on a number of companies that are manufacturers, I think it's an economic imperative. Now, it is going to be a ridiculously tough needle to thread because of the anti-trade sentiment in this country. The way trade, I think, unfortunately, has now been sort of demonized, not just among the traditional Democratic constituencies, but frankly, the way Trump elevated that to sort of a universal skepticism among all Americans. But that doesn't change the economic reality that I think we're at a huge competitive disadvantage if we think we can just stick our head in the sand and say no. Unfortunately, I think the pain's going to have to get to be so real that then Biden will have that cover to do it. But the reality is the first 24 months of this administration are going to be spent on the pandemic and trying to jumpstart the economy. That gives the new U.S. Trade Ambassador, Catherine Tai, who has a much deeper understanding, certainly, of the mechanics of trade, to begin with work with other members of the administration and others, I think, to quietly build the case for why we would need to do that. I mean, I'm encouraged that there are some of us that believe personnel is policy, and I think at least if you look at the breadth, the history, the competency of the Biden foreign relations team writ large, from Secretary of State and others, they get it. So I'm hopeful that I know they know better, and I'd like to believe John Holdren and I were still sitting there on the couch whispering in somebody's ear. John, I got to tell you, you look a lot cooler now that you're back in the academic world. Almost didn't recognize him, Reed. I mean, he's kind of got this Sean Connery-ish, professorial look.
My blood pressure went down 20 points when I left the White House at the end of the
Boy, didn't all of ours. Good to be with you. Susan, let me stop with that. I hope so, but I don't know how they do it. And I would say it is complicated by the reality. The Trade Promotion Authority will expire this summer, but I just can't imagine the Biden team trying to bite that off while they're trying to do the infrastructure bill and the stimulus and everything else.
Can I offer a few thoughts on that, Susan?
Sure.
So I want to start by agreeing with Ron Kirk that the trade is certainly going to be hard. But I think that President Biden has already been demonstrating that he can chew gum and walk at the same time. And I have some hope that he will take this on along with the many other things on his plate. I also think that science and technology cooperation between the United States and China is at least somewhat easier. And I wanted to mention that I am still collaborating with Wan Gong, with Shui Lan, with Xie Zhenhua, the chief climate negotiator in China, all people I worked with not only during the administration, but before the Obama administration. I've been working with Shui Lan since the 90s. Met Xie Zhenhua in the when he was president of the Chinese EPA, and we have formal joint foundation-funded projects working together on U.S.-China pathways to deep decarbonization, comparing notes, sharing best practices, trying to understand for both countries what the most promising pathways are to achieve their ambitions in terms of basically getting to zero by 2050 or 2060. There are also ongoing science and technology collaborations at the government-to-government level, including the China Clean Energy Research, the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center, which went on even in the Trump administration. It was established early in the Obama administration. It continued through the Trump administration, I assume because Trump never noticed, and nobody at DOE, which ran it on the DOE side, ever called attention to it. We can expect that to expand. I think the joint work on carbon capture and sequestration, which is of great importance in both countries, is going to continue. And I am at least guardedly optimistic that in spite of all of the damage that has been manifested in the relationship between the United States and China, that we are going to be able to get some important things done on issues that are so clearly in the interest of both countries.
Susan, if I could just throw just a couple of remarks building on these. Racing through the 23 years between Peter's agreement was reached in February of '97 and now, I guess it's 24 years now. The essential vision that Peter had and that he got so many of the countries to embrace was that there would be no borders with respect to information. And number two, that the participants on the information platform would be people, not governments, not autocrats. The governments could say what they wanted to say, but people had an indivisible, unalienable right to participate on the information platform of the world. That's the essential vision. Nothing could have been more disruptive even when it was being advocated, but it has become an even more challenging vision to press against the rest of the world because, of course, you can pick China or you can pick other countries. They now see that the capability, they've come to see that the capability of information platforms brings along with it the ability to have a total surveillance of a population, extraordinary amount of knowledge about the activities of each individual and certainly of any group, and an immense power to inform or to misinform. That's all now utterly understood. I would say that we had some glimmer of that from the very early going, but now it's absolutely clear. And so, as you know, Susan, you're an expert in this. And others in this call really have studied this, to a very substantial degree. China, in particular, wants both at the level of international interaction, but also at a deep technological level, to change the fundamental workings of these communications platforms so that technically there are walls. And I don't mean just the clumsy Great Firewall. I mean innumerable other walls that in turn permit the government of the country, China, for example, to put a watchdog on top of that wall and see, who's trying to climb it, who's trying to burrow under it. That's the fundamental challenge. It's not really different in kind from the nature of the discussion that led to the telecom agreement. But the big difference in 1997 is that the rest of the world was simply in awe of what was going on in the United States. And we were close enough to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Reagan-dubbed evil empire that the United States' persuasive power and economic power was so incredibly overwhelming that the whole rest of the world said, well, whatever are the risks to our autocracies and our hegemonies, we want a piece of that. So what I love about what Joe Biden is doing is that he has seen, and Ron knows all about this, he has seen it's just as hard to do something small in politics as it is to do something big. So you might as well do the big thing, right? And so he's doing, the B in Biden apparently stands for big and bold. And what that's doing is gaining persuasive power for the United States. Now, the infrastructure bill has to be passed. So if any of you want to, talk to Joe Manchin, please go do so. The infrastructure bill has to be passed, because without that, we will not be building the platform in broadband, the platform for clean power, and the platform for all the other fundamental, activities of society. But what we do have now is the kind of spirit of revival and hope that was, I think, the best part of the Clinton administration, and that animated the successful negotiations. So that's what gives me a sense that there's a lot more gas being put in our tank, although it's an electric motor we're talking about now. And that's why Ron and John, I think, are right to say, at the right time, we'll have another crack at the kind of open market agreement that is necessary for the whole world to share in prosperity.
And I make one friendly.
If I could just add one thing. No, and Reed reminded, and I want to be careful, but because all of us have had the privilege over the years, me not as long, but working with a number of people in the administration, including now President Biden. But Reed said something about him going big. As a Democrat, we should not speak of it nor say it, but I get the sense Joe Biden is governing with the liberation of, I'm going to be a one-term president. And I think that frees you to say, I'm going to swing for the fences and do what I think is right, whether it's on infrastructure or others. And in that, if you believe in that broader proposition that frees Joe to do a little bit more than he might, I think, given the inherent truth that we are going to be really disadvantaged, particularly in the Asia Pacific, back to your original question, Susan, I think that could give him a little more latitude to say, this is something that we're going to have to get done no matter how painful. So that does give me
last word to John, and then we need to turn to the next stage of our program.
I just want to make a very short, friendly amendment to Reed's comment about the B in Biden. I think the B in Biden stands for big, bold, and better.
Okay, that's accepted.
Well, and I just want to say that this discussion today, especially about how Peter's been able to figure out how you get a global agreement that facilitates continued interactions, economic, technological. The need is now more than ever for some new agreements, maybe not totally global, maybe they're kind of mini-lateral, they're boutique agreements. But I've heard Peter's already thinking in this direction. So I think we might anticipate that once the United States gets more gas in the tank and is out there proposing some ideas for international rules for telecom and other technology cooperation, it's once again going to be ideas developed by Peter with colleagues that he's working together with, will come and help us save globalization. So with that optimistic prediction, I'd like to turn it over to Peter for a couple of remarks.
Thank you. So as is clear, I always wanted to marry scholarship to public service. But what you've seen in this panel is that that was a learning experience for me, that there are tremendous people trying to make things better. And one of the challenges, I think, for scholars in trying to undertake public service is that often we don't listen and learn. We have a great ability to broadcast, but when we stop to listen, well, we go, well, that's interesting they said that, but now let me tell you why I was right. And one of the things I've learned from working with terrific people, like you've heard this morning, is that there are deep understandings of things that if we don't pay attention to with all of our ideal models and insights, we're not going to get anywhere. And I hope that that is something that in our teaching as a professional school, we've imparted to our students as a spirit as well. That said, I also want to say that experts can do something that I associate with John as an example, which is to keep our eyes on the fundamentals of what's driving society in the long term, and reminding us that no matter how difficult things are in the short term, there are long-term possibilities that experts can play a special role in being a midwife for, in a sense. And that is a special leavening that scholarship can bring to the system. Now, all that said, I do want to tell two stories just so there's a little perspective on what you've heard this morning. The first is Reed has painted me as both a visionary and kind of an enforcer. And yes, we did have some fun with both sides of that. But I hope that when we heard Carlos Casasus, that there was an important dynamic that emerged. Carlos, as Reed and I both agree, is one of the most impressive people we dealt with in our years in government in other countries. And what we were trying to do with this combination of big ideas and strategy and a stick to incent people to pay attention, especially when the decisions were hard, was to open a discussion really about there is something better that the short-term pain opens up that goes far beyond anything you imagined. When Reed and I walked in, the Maitland Commission, this blue ribbon all-star global panel, had said there wasn't much prospect for having a broad outreach of communications technology to the poor people around the world. It would be a very limited, slow slog. And what we believed was that if you radically cut the cartel pricing out of communications and made people actually earn the money the old-fashioned way of investing, offering services, building out to new populations with new technologies, the world could be different. And people like Carlos in country after country came to recognize as partners that we could do that. And the use of the stick was sometimes just to help them get through some of their problems. And then, of course, as Carlos related, we would negotiate all sorts of ad hoc transit agreements in order to get us from here to there in a way they could swallow. The other story I just want to tell is about Ron Kirk, because it's a reminder about what practical politics means for international negotiations. And Ron may have forgotten this, but shortly after he became the US Trade Representative, a very famous, highly opinionated and influential European trade official showed up in Washington, DC to meet with Ron and me. And he lectures Ron on, you know, this deal that we have at the WTO that's stalled, why, if you just simply had some guts and put your elbow to it, you could get this through in the US and it would go forward globally and everybody would be better off. I've talked here in Washington, I know you can get this done. And Ron, who had practical street level politics as a mayor in America, looked at him and started to talk about the difficulties of constructing a new garage at the Dallas airport. And at first, this guy looked totally bewildered. But at the end, he realized that Ron had told him in a very nice way, you don't really know anything about the practical politics of this. Don't come into my office and try to tell me that I should sell a trade deal that will fail if I told the president to bring it forward to Congress. There is much wisdom in practical politics that we experts should pay attention to. Thanks to all of you for being great teachers.
Well, thanks to Peter and thanks to the panel. And now we have a special surprise for everyone, including Peter. It's a special tribute from his friends and colleagues.
Peter has been a spectacular leader for UC San Diego. Because of him, GPS is positioned as one of the top policy-oriented schools in the country. And I remember the very first time I visited campus, and Peter was one of the deans who I met with, and immediately I felt like there was a bond between us because he was very strategic in his approach to the way he viewed the growth on campus. He was very open about the issues, the challenges, and also the opportunities. And he actually had a genuine sense of warmth about him. So when I talked to him, I knew that there was some sort of a professional connection that could be established and that I could count on him going into the future.
Peter exhibits a warmth and a friendliness and a sense of humanity to draw people to him. He's an attractor.
Peter has many great qualities as a leader. The first thing that comes to my mind is that he's a visionary. He sees big trends and sets clear directions.
Peter really is unique, one of the few people I know who has that combination of skills of the personal, the policy, and the professional to put the pieces together and make it work.
Well, Peter has always been very valuable to both myself personally and to Qualcomm. And his thoughts on policy and how you blend that with the new technology that's continually coming into the world has been helpful to us in guiding Qualcomm when I was still there, and now in helping make various recommendations on political issues since.
There's always a genuineness about Peter, combined with a very clear purposefulness. You always know what he wants to achieve and where he wants to go. And I think that combination of authenticity and purposefulness has gotten lots and lots of people to like Peter, to believe in him, and to want to follow him. And as a result, you've got the school that you now have.
Peter had a vision of where the world was going.
When you see someone like Peter Cowhey, you know what real leadership is. I mean, a leader is someone who can get everybody else excited about moving in a new direction.
If you look back and see the dreams that Peter had, those dreams have now come to fruition with the various centers across each and every part of GPS, from where we started with IGCC to US-Mexico Center, to more recently 21st Century China, and to the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy. That bit by bit, compounding over the years, has taken this school to be one of the best schools of foreign policy, of international relations in the United States and the world.
Peter builds on the intellectual passions of the faculty. And so what I notice is year after year, there are more and more faculty whose ideas and research is being picked up by the media and by the policy community.
I think that Peter has been a protein thinker and leader. And what makes him so extraordinary, if you look at the span of his achievements, in terms of books that he's written, government policies that he's helped to shape, academic curricula that he's developed and put into place, and not least, of course, GPS itself, It's really an extraordinary career, and he's been able to pull it all together to make them come alive for GPS.
So the school has gone through continuous growth and transformation since its establishment. But today, the school is much more. It has expanded its research to interdisciplinary areas, leveraging UCSD's STEM expertise.
I think many people know that Peter himself has an IT or a telecommunication background. So that allows him to create bridges with engineering and computer science. And I think because of Peter's work in cybersecurity policy and our other work in cybersecurity technology, we have become one of the few places in the country as a go-to place for cybersecurity technology and policy, which has really positioned us very strongly.
He's had a wide range of influence among the people whose lives he's touched directly, and all the ones who, through his policies and other activities, he's touched indirectly.
I can say that the best gift I had in serving for 14 years at GPS was the gift of my friendship with Peter Cowhey.
I think he's done a remarkable job as dean over the years. The school, of course, started out strongly, but it's really come a long way under his leadership.
Peter Cowhey has been great. Peter Cowhey's been a wonderful dean. He has taken it in directions that I didn't even think of.
Of course, we wish Peter a great retirement, so long as it doesn't involve too much time away from GPS, where we're still full of ideas about new projects for him and continuing his work on science and technology and US-China relations, policy efforts, research efforts related to international technology policy. We can't really afford to let Peter just go and be a lazy retiree traveling the world. We still have a lot of things we need him to do.
When Peter first told me he was going to retire, I actually was shocked because I did not think he would ever retire. And honestly, I did not want him to retire because he has done such a spectacular job. Knowing Peter's history with UC San Diego, I know that even after he retires, he would still be involved in supporting us, in helping us, and strategizing with us. And I hope, especially for me personally, we would continue our friendship and I could call on him for his advice every so often, not too much, but every so often, and be connected to Peter and to Margaret after Peter's retirement.
That's clearly going to be a tough act to follow. Let me just say we are now at the part in our program where we're ready for our second break. We will resume again at 11:35 a.m. Pacific time sharp.